I have 5 o'clock, so we'll open and call to order the June meeting of the Carroll County Economic Development Authority. Kay will not be with us tonight. She had a conflict that she couldn't get out of, so I think all the members are here. And we'll go ahead and proceed with the pledge, and followed by the invocation. Mike will lead us in the invocation. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Let's bow our heads together. Father, thank you for this opportunity to gather with these folks who've come. Thank you for this board who you've called to do the business of the EDA. We pray that you would give us guidance and wisdom. In Jesus' name, amen. Amen.
I want to welcome everyone, and we see that we have some citizens here. Is anyone here to speak at citizens' time? If so, now's the proper time. Hearing none, we'll go to the next item on the agenda, which is minutes of the previous meeting. Do we want to have those read today, or do we want to just ask everyone if they've had a chance to look over the meeting? Does anyone want to hear the minutes read?
I don't see the reason or reason.
Okay.
We've made the changes and additions, and Andy sent me something, and Ronnie sent something. And we included those in the minutes.
Any discussion on the minutes? I would like to make a few comments on the additions that Ms. McCraw added. Essentially, the additions on the sediment pond, I'm going to ask if we feel that is necessary to add that to the official minutes of the discussion, since the EDA transaction was essentially in order both on the agreement side and on the transaction side. Does that still need to, you think, be in the minutes?
Are you asking me personally?
Yes, this was your
I
minute.
think that anything that we discuss should be included in the minutes, personally.
So even if it has no bearing or no ultimate bearing on this body?
I agree. I think it should be included.
So I do want to make a comment on the second thing, which was the $200 maintenance fee for the little tykes for the repairing the potholes. So I guess my question on that is, what do we have the dispute with, or what's the reason that we feel like that we need to add that part to the discussion?
I just, like I said before, think that everything that we discuss should be included in the minutes. The $200 came as an estimate from Salel.
But in my opinion, the alternative is to actually spend money outside of the county, where $200 estimate is coming from the county maintenance group, which, as long as there's no overtime present, we're just simply transferring money from the EDA to the county, and no money actually leaves the county. So I guess my question would be,
But
is
there's
there a
still a
problem
transaction
with that?
between the EDA to pay for that.
And we still would have to approve the transaction. And I guess my only issue with the Vanguard request is the request really never came before the board. It was something that was asked about because there had been some emails about it, but the transaction or the request never officially came before the board. And I know I'm sounding picky on this, when I say it, but in my opinion, if we include everything that's not a motion or an accepted report, we end up having every single thing included in the minutes. And
Have you read the Board of Supervisor minutes?
Well, they're transcribed.
Well, I think that we should include everything that we discuss.
And
We're trying to be transparent, right?
yes,
I think that we should include everything that we discuss in the meeting.
and
If it pertains to business relating to the EDA, then it should be included in the minutes.
but
And then if you don't like it, don't vote to approve it.
the issue with that, though, is that not everything that's brought up, if it's not on the agenda and it's brought up and then it's discussed and it was never a business item, it clutters the minutes. If you went back and tried to find something years later that, and it's very difficult. So
Yeah, I
when-
spent a
whenever-
day up in your file room up here.
When everything is transcribed, you lose a lot of the clarity of what the meeting was about. So we do need to kind of get to a standard on minutes. So one way of adopting a standard for minutes is to say that the transaction of the business is documented, but a lot of the discussion around the transaction of the business is limited to pertinent items only. And if there was no motion made, no official business before the board, then why do we have to have the discussion around a topic that was never an official business item of the board?
Well, I sent the email because I felt that it was pertinent to our conversation.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes, sir.
if I might, just to at least lay the floor for what the Code of Virginia requires in the minutes.
Okay.
Freedom of Information Act requires that the minutes, of course, be in writing and shall include the date, time, and location of the meeting, the members of the public body recorded as present and absent, a summary of the discussion on matters proposed, deliberated, or decided, and a record of any votes taken. And then there are additional requirements for electronic minutes, but I don't think that's really relevant for the moment.
So,
So that's the,
so in your opinion, if we had something that was asked about, but there was no action taken, or no formal motion made, no action taken, it was just asked about it, you would still include those
I probably would if it was
discussions
a
in the
matter that was proposed, deliberated, or decided. So it's not just your action items. If it's something that's brought up as a topic for discussion, something that's proposed for action on public business, then that probably would be properly included.
Very good. Thank you for your comments. Anybody else have any comments on the minutes from last meeting? Sure.
I got I can't speak, because I'm like I'm underwater. I sent something in response to the part that had to do with the transaction that we reported for one of our sales. And I don't know, I did it in sort of a memo thing off to the side. I don't know if that became visible or not. It's supposed to. And I don't know that anything has been changed. My concern and what I was trying to express in that is that the way that that's currently worded, if I were saying it, I would be concerned that it would be construed that there is a disparity or a variance in our records between numbers. And because I do the numbers and have the records, that concerned me, because the minutes that we have, the document that I got a copy from the bank, the document that I have that indicates how much the check was paid for, as well as the validation of the deposit, are all in concert. They all say the same thing. So it concerns me that it would appear in our minutes that there is a discrepancy between two numbers in our records, and that is not the case.
True. It's between us and county stuff.
Well, it's not
It's-
really.
it's-
That's kind of, I guess, the way I look at it is, when it comes to the audit we will have as a body, the EDA, will have no answer or question concerning anything that goes on in the tax office. We don't provide documents for them on their behalf, but everything in our records is as it is in our books, as it is in our minutes, as it is in our bank account. So it concerns me that that's being put into the minutes as though that's some kind of discrepancy, when in fact, that is just, it's a data entry that was made by someone in the county over which we have no control.
Right.
So that was why I sent the suggestion.
Any other comments or discussions on previous minutes? Hearing none, do we have a motion to accept?
I make the motion we accept the minutes as presented.
We have a motion, do we have a second? We have a motion, do we have a second, or do we still need time to discuss amendments or comments?
Has Ms. West's comments been included in the minutes?
That's a good question. So, how do we want to handle that, Sandy? Would you want just that part dealing with the discrepancy removed, if that's agreeable with the board?
Well, as the treasurer, in terms of just making sure that it is accurate from the standpoint of the way I see what I'm doing as far as the records, I would rather it not be there at all, the way it's presented, or if it's going to stay, I think it's important to note that there is no discrepancy in the EDA records. There is a variance with a data entry in the tax office, which is what it is. At least that's what it is at this point. I don't know where they get their information, and so I can't address that. I can't speak to it, which is why it concerns me the way it is.
So, Ms. McCraw, we have no second to the motion. Would you be agreeable to removing the section on the sediment pond, since it does include errors in the?
I think that we should, can we make an addition to that statement? Because we still haven't clarified where the error is for sure, right? Their
No.
records show it was a certain
I would
price.
say that we, as far, and again, I'm not trying to split hairs, I'm trying to look at it from the standpoint of where the responsibility would lie to validate records if we were, say, in the audit, which we're about to go through another one. And as far as the audit is concerned, I have a picture of a check made out to us that is validated by what went into our bank account, which is the same thing that was in our minutes. So there is no discrepancy in our area at all.
So, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but at that point, our books are clear, right? There was an agreement to
Correct.
sell a piece of land for
Correct.
$90,000. We received $90,000 in
Correct.
payments. We go back to the minutes of the approval of this board. They're in order. So at that point in time, there is no,
And that's my only concern.
Actually, it wasn't listed in minutes.
it was.
I didn't see a price in those minutes. I found the check.
I would go back to the minutes, actually showed Mr. Sowers making the motion for the transaction.
I think there's a copy somewhere.
So can we make an addition to that?
Yeah, I did put it in there.
Say again, Larry.
Mandy added it.
Yeah.
But can we make Sandy's addition to that? To approve the minutes? It's concerning to me that there's an error somewhere. Whether it's not us, but it's somebody, and that needs to be corrected.
But it's not an error. It's not our error.
It's not something to be fixed in here.
That's where you
There's
get
no
into.
error on the part of the EDA. There's an error somewhere outside what transaction
Yeah.
happened here. So it really doesn't pertain to us. I mean, we can pass it down the line to whoever it belongs to, but it doesn't belong to us.
That's where we have to be careful when you get into discussions. That's something that's external to us. We can't take care of the rest of the world. We got to concentrate on the EDA. And if those records are correct, then that's all we can do. Now, we can go, we can caution other bodies that they need to be accurate. But you're essentially saying your records are accurate and they're going to be sustained in the audit, so we can't worry about anything else.
These are old enough, they've already been through the audit, but I guess, again, what I'm trying to say, I think, is that as far as everything that we as a body have responsibility for, there is no discrepancy. And that's the part that concerns me, because the way that that's worded, it appears that there is a discrepancy, as though there are, let's just say there are funds that were deposited that are not accounted for. And that's actually, I think, the wording, and I think that's what caught my attention, was there are no unaccounted for funds. That's a very, how a person could construe that statement is really a problem. And that's why I wanted to make sure that we changed it so that it reads, if it's there at all, that it is a memo note of some kind that in researching the county's records, there is a difference in the county's records and our records, but within our records, all of our data is in fact in sync. And so there isn't anything in our end of things that, quote, has not been accounted for. And that was why I said what I did, because I think that is the wording, that there appears to be X amount, quote, unaccounted for. And that's not true on our end. That's simply not true. The documents that we have all say the same thing, and they are all pertaining to what we recorded in our books. And that's why it concerns me. So if there's an entry in the county's records, and I haven't seen it in the books, so I don't know about the books part. I don't know what they would, how that would be, but as far as the county's tax document, which is public record that you can go online and look at it, it simply has a number on there that someone somewhere was provided. I have no idea where it came from. But it didn't come from here, and that's what concerns me.
So can we make an addition to approve the minutes?
Anyone could make an amendment to the minutes that have been submitted. So if someone wants to make an amendment to that, to remove or add anything, then it's up to the body here to vote on the approval of that amendment.
I don't think related to contact. As your treasurer, it is particularly concerning to me that someone could be reading those minutes 3 years from now and think that in the discharge of my responsibilities, there was something unaccounted for. That disturbs me. So I don't want, while I'm the one responsible for it, I would not prefer that wording be used that way, because it's going to be out of context 3 years from now. And there is no discrepancy in the records. There is nothing unaccounted for. That's what concerns me.
So how do you want to word an amendment?
Well, if you feel like that is something that needs to be addressed in the EDA's minutes, which that's not my concern, that would be the body's concern. It would be that the records, the audited records of the IDA are different than a data entry transaction made by the tax office. That's the best way I can put that.
So if we simply remove the speculative part, which begins with the words, "It was also during this time we discovered a substantial amount of funds that were unaccounted for, nearly $18,000. And then go down to the part where it gets back to just the transaction itself. Then that's stating the facts, but not entering in the fact that the EDA is missing any money, because we're not. We have an agreement to sell a property for $90,000 in years past, and we received $90,000 plus or minus for that. $90,200 to be exact. Would you be agreeable, Ms. McCraw, for removing those sentences from the amendment, your amendment to the minutes?
No.
Do we have amendment on the floor?
We do not have an amendment on the floor.
I move that we remove any reference to that stated statement.
We have an amendment to remove any reference to that stated statement of the $18,000. And do we have a second?
So you're gonna remove that, what you just read?
If I understand it, it would be, and I'm going to read the whole thing that I think Mr. Edwards is proposing to remove. It was during this time we discovered a substantial amount of funds that were unaccounted for, nearly $18,000 from the sale of this property in 2018, in addition to incorrect dates of sale as reflected in recording documents. This was researched during our meeting, and the Carroll County GIS showed that the sale of the property took place in December for $108,000. In Ms. West's records indicate the sale occurred in February, with the EDA only receiving $90,200. It was also discovered that the rent, well, at that point in time right there, that ends the discussion on the $18,000.
The issue with that is that the contract was signed in December. And again, just from the standpoint of how a person could perceive what was said there, the contract was signed in December. I saw a copy of it as we were going through this process. But the check date is February. So it might sound a little bit like splitting hairs, but the agreement to sell was in fact in December. My statement is not that the sale didn't take place till February. My records are that I received a check in February, at which time it was deposited. Presumably that was the closing period, but I don't want the EDA's records to appear to be erroneous in terms of its statement when the sale took place, as opposed to when the contract was signed. So it's two different occurrences, and that, I had forgotten about that.
So we have an amendment before us. We're not voting to approve the minutes. We're only voting on this amendment if we have a second. We do not currently have a second. Does anyone have a second for removing the sentences in Larry's motion that I read?
I'll second that.
We have a second from Mr. Sowers. Is there any other discussion on the amendment? Do we have any further discussion just on the amendment right now?
I'm not sure why we can't word an amendment and put it in the minutes, like Sandy stated, without removing that.
You may. You can offer an amendment to state anything you want to. So right now, we have an amendment before us, and the amendment has been seconded. So according to our rules, we're going to just discuss the amendment that is before us right now. So we have an amendment before us. Is there any discussion on that amendment? And Ms. McCraw, this is your time to actually persuade your colleagues that you have a better amendment to offer, if in fact you have a better amendment to offer.
I think we need to add an amendment to the minutes that reads something to the effect of, upon further review, Ms. West presented to the IDA or EDA that our records are in order, that the flaw lies with the county, whatever. That's where the flaw is.
Any other discussion?
Because whether it's in the minutes or whether it's not, if you're looking at GIS, if you're looking at EDA minutes, if you pull the property up and look at the record of sale, GIS is going to tell you one thing and our minutes are going to tell you something else, regardless of whose fault that it is, or error.
Right now, the discussion is on the amendment. Right now, the discussion is not on GIS. The discussion is on the
I was
amendment.
pleading my case to my colleagues.
So that is the question before us, is whether that's a proper amendment, or you may approve the amendment, you may vote no and substitute Ms. McCraw's amendment. But the discussion right now is on the amendment. Mr. Collins.
I'm just not sure that there's enough clarity because of what we've been through at this point to just remove it. But I would have another thought for an amendment, but we have one on the floor, so. I just
Mr.
feel like there
Durbin.
needs to be more clarity of what's going on.
Mr. Chairman, if I follow your proceedings correctly, and just to make sure that I hate to keep interjecting myself, but I want to make sure that I'm on the same page with everyone. I think what is considered is to strike certain language that was proposed by Ms. McCraw, but not to approve those minutes yet.
Right now, we're only debating the amendment to the one section. We're not debating approving the minutes at this
Okay.
time.
So it would be possible to approve that amendment by striking that language, and then someone else, the next motion could be to clarify it further,
That's
maybe
correct.
something that would be agreeable to everyone.
That is correct.
Okay, just wanted to,
So,
Put that out.
so Mr. Durbin is correct. We could approve the amendment as offered by Mr. Edwards and seconded,
Taking that out and then whatever.
And then,
and
yeah,
then inserting whatever
to add to
language
it.
that
Right.
you all, as a body, agree needs to be inserted. So, the question before us is on the amendment to strike the sentences read. Any further discussion? Okay, if we're prepared to vote on the amendment, all in favor of approving the amended language of striking out the sentences read to us, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All opposed, say no.
No.
So please let the minutes show that we had one no vote, Ms. McCraw voted no. Okay, so now we are back to the minutes as amended by your recent vote. So, are there any amendments, further amendments to the minutes that you require, or you would like to?
I have a question I'd like to address to legal counsel. Since GIS has been brought up, is that considered to be a legal? I find a lot of discrepancies in GIS.
it's a county record. It's a public record, but there is a disclaimer on the GIS system that says you can't rely on this, that the final controlling documents are as recorded in the circuit court clerk's office.
That answers my question.
Okay, so, Ms. McCraw, do you want to add a sentence or something to that at this time? Do you have something you'd like to add?
I have a suggestion, if that would be okay. I would suggest that we add to the minutes that it came to this body, that there was a discrepancy in a sale that was made by the EDA board, at that time the IDA board, between what the IDA records are and what the GIS records are, and that it was determined, and this is exactly what happened, that it would be investigated and we would find out what the issue was. At that point, when we left the meeting, there was not clarity in some of our minds what the absolute was. But now we have that, and it was just a couple of days after that meeting that I got documentation from the county administrator, from the executive director of this board, that's exactly what happened, that the sale that we had recorded was for $90,200. The check that we received was for $90,200, and that we don't have any control over what the GIS states. So I think it needs to be referenced in there that we had this discussion about a discrepancy that was brought to our attention that's not a discrepancy of ours. Now, I can work on how you word that, but.
I guess my basic concern is we've had an audit that we know is correct. So we don't want to do anything or show anything contrary to that. But I don't have an issue with raising questions for other bodies to address.
So we have the minutes before us, and it's in your hands. We can either approve the minutes as they are right now, as we've amended, or we can entertain a further amendment. So do we have a motion for either?
I make a motion, Ronnie Collins put his verbiage into an amendment to be added to the minute.
In the last meeting, I asked that, that as much as possible, we have these things written down. So if you'd like to delay this acceptance of the minutes until a later part of the meeting, until Ronnie, you and Ms. McCraw have a chance to get the right language. And if that is agreeable, we'll defer this to later in the meeting and get that right language for a proposed law. Does anybody, I don't want to do anything that gets ahead of the board, but is that agreeable? Mr. Durbin, is that something that we can do?
As chairman, I think you can defer a matter without objection from the membership and take it up at a later time.
Okay. We'll move this down to just before authority members' time for everyone's reference.
Alternatively, Mr. Chairman, you could do a motion to lay it on the table until a later time.
Okay.
Or would like to have a formal vote on that.
There's no disagreement, we'll just move that down to just prior to authority members' time, unless there needs to be a formal motion. So we'll move on to section 5 of the agenda, and I think now that's your part, Mr. Durbin, discussion of Carroll Board of Supervisors directions, contracts, and conflicts of interest.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I hope that you and all the members of the board will bear with me. Due to Mr. Dalton being ill last week, I just found out about, I was just asked to be at this meeting late last night, so I haven't studied the issues in depth, but I think what I'll do is briefly describe a few of the high points that Mr. Dalton wanted to have as topics for discussion, and then if there are any questions from the board, I'd be happy to address those. But starting with the discussion of the Board of Supervisors' directions, I think it's fair to say that the feeling of the board is that the county government writ large, not just the Board of Supervisors, not just the EDA, not just the PSA, but writ large, has extended itself in terms of financial obligations without always having sufficient revenues to meet those obligations. And the board's issued a motion on March 23rd as a statement of policy, I think, for future transactions and how they'd like reporting and public documents to be handled. And that was in the Board of Supervisors minutes of March 23rd, 2020. It covers topics such as reporting transactions engaged by the EDA, an action item for vacant lands to be turned over to the Board of Supervisors from the EDA, that certain grant criteria be imposed that would require, for example, applicants to be up to date on all county tax payments before they would be eligible for any grants or funding incentives from the EDA. Submit to background and criminal history check. Request that the EDA work closely with the Commissioner of Revenue to ensure that all agreements meet the machinery and tool and other tax requirements. I think that is really addressed to making sure that our agreements are stated in a way that's going to correspond to the way that the constitutional officers are going to classify taxable items. And there's a number of
I hate to
sorry.
interrupt you, but are you wanting to go through all 20 of these tonight and have a discussion on all 20 of these?
No, Mr. Chairman, I was just sort of hitting a few of them.
You hit some good ones, is the reason I was kind of interested, so.
Yeah, the ones that I saw as sort of most relevant, of course, if point 14 on the minutes would be that any loan request to the EDA be approved by the Board of Supervisors in a resolution or specific board vote And that's really in the situation that anytime the county would provide moral obligation or subject to appropriation financing, of course, the Code of Virginia would require that the Board of Supervisors approve that financing. In fact, the county could not be obligated on a moral obligation without a vote of the Board of Supervisors to accept that moral obligation. But I think that's,
So I've got one question about that. Is the reverse also true? Is the EDA bound to a financial obligation of the Board of Supervisors that they wish to do and they wish to fund, but the EDA disagrees? Would that also be true?
both the County Board of Supervisors and the EDA are distinct legal entities that cannot be bound without the affirmative vote of its board. So Board of Supervisors is the only authority that can legally bind the county. And by the same token, this board is the only entity that can legally bind the EDA.
Okay. And also on there, the question that I had some concern with was item 13, which is all EDA funds shall be deposited through the treasurer's office. And my response to that has been and always will be, is that a good idea? Is that maintaining an arm's length transaction that should be held, I think, between the two groups of not commingling money between the EDA and the Board of Supervisors? So what's your opinion on item 13?
I think that it's possible that, I think that it would be important to segregate those in a separate line item, but I think the treasurer's office can't handle EDA funds if that's.
And I understand that they can, but I guess they should. A lot of times we confuse the word can from should. Should we commingle EDA funds with county general treasury funds?
Mr. Chairman,
We're
that's.
looking to you for guidance right
Yeah,
here.
and Mr. Chairman, the reason you can probably see me grinning even through the mask is that that's really a policy question. That whether it's prudent or not is a question that the elected and appointed officials must determine.
So that being the case, the Board of Supervisors could just insist that we turn our money over, commingle our money with the general treasury, and have a statement made that shows EDA funds separated from general Carroll County Treasury funds.
I think that's the directive of the Board of Supervisors. Ultimately, the decision to do so is with this board, mindful of that there may be consequences in terms of future funding.
I'd like to hear what Sandy has to say just about that item right there.
Can you be a little bit more specific?
Would you, given your history, would you think it would be a good idea to, item 13 of this recommendation says all EDA funds shall be deposited through the treasurer's office. It then has parentheses, allows the county to save funds on banking fees. I would argue that that's probably minimal on the savings
Well,
on
and as
that.
far as substantiation, as far as the fees are concerned, since they're $20 a month, I don't really think that would be a major concern. Probably some of the issues from, again, going to the past, some of the issues from the past might include that at one time that was the case. There's a lot of complications arise with the actual audit itself, if that's the case, because the records themselves are in different places and held responsible for by different individuals. I don't know logistically what that looks like as far as if I know, for instance, that one of the other departments within the county receives funds and then they write a check to the county for those funds. I don't know how that, in the background, I don't know how that's done as far as reconciling. I don't know how that plays out in terms of knowing what we have to pay bills deals with at any given point in time. Currently, the board had approved several years ago that we do have access online banking, which both the county administrator and myself have the token to be able to access that. So I don't know if they're saying if we go through the treasurer's account, obviously we lose that visibility, because I sincerely doubt the county would give us the access to their account. That's just a guess, I could be wrong, but that's just a guess. To me, it would complicate a lot of what we're doing in terms of the record keeping and the actual processing. That might be a desired result, I don't know, but it would complicate it.
Is there a benefit that you can see from implementing that?
No. I mean, not from a cost saving standpoint. To my way of thinking, the two entities still would have to be independently audited. Going back to the period of time when I first started working with the board, where the treasurer's office was handling funds, and I would say that our audits were more complicated than they are now. Some of that is due to digitalizing things, and some of it would just be due to the fact that when you've got different people involved, there's going to be different records kept in different places. So I don't know how that would impact the cost of the audits, but would it simplify things, or can I see a benefit to it? Not off the top of my head. I mean, not based on the history that I have with the board. I don't know that I would be able to say that I see a benefit to it. I don't think I would be able to report to you as concisely and as quickly on the basis of how we do things now, but that doesn't mean it can't be done.
So this document was, I think, emailed to everyone before the last meeting, and we had some discussion on it at the last meeting. Are there any general questions from the list of 20 that was presented to us by Rex Hill?
I think that additionally, just sort of generally, that Mr. Dalton also wanted to reiterate that, of course, the EDA is subject to the Virginia Public Procurement Act when acquiring goods and services, although there are certain exceptions, and I'd be happy to walk the authority through on a case-by-case basis when transactions are before the board for action on that, because the details will matter on that. Additionally, be mindful of Conflict of Interest Act, and overall, I think that the board is looking for maybe a closer level of coordination between the Board of Supervisors and the EDA in terms of what projects are going forward, even from the negotiation stage, when we have a prospect for economic development, that be coordinated closely with the board.
Would you clarify, Mr. Durbin, your comment that it could affect future funding? What did you mean by that?
What I mean is that the EDA is an independent legal entity. It has its own funds and is not technically, I don't think I'm telling anyone something they don't know, they're technically not under the control and direction of the Board of Supervisors, except for future appointments of board members and for funding for future projects. So those are the sort of the two levers that are available to the Board of Supervisors to enforce any sort of policy that they would issue. I have there's no specific sort of, we're going to withhold that or this. I've not gotten any sort of direction like that.
So, one other, I will say that 19 of the 20 of these things, I, for the most part, agree with. They're good policy. I think it would be good to have have this as guidance. I think one thing that I would ask the board is, you know, you can give me all the specifications to a car, but I'd like to see a picture of it. You know, if that makes sense. I'd like to see what the application process looked like. I'd like to see kind of what the reports would look like. I'd like to see a lot of things of how this thing would drive around, so to speak. And what I see right here is kind of 20 things that are, you know, very cold and dry and may be easy to implement, easy to enact, but not very practical.
Some of these you really won't implement until you get there. Some of these are just recommendations, just quotations from what's already your obligation under the Code of Virginia. References to, for example, I think it's 15.24907, which is just the sort of the applicant's statement that's required under the code for anyone applying for
And just for my
assistance.
curiosity, does this come from some best practices, county, city, municipal government, best practices study or something where this was just gleaned from that, or what's the origin of this? Where can I go back and get some more information on the
And
origin of these 20?
That's a question. I didn't craft these. I'm not sure what the source was. I think you'd have to go back to Mr. Hill on that one.
Okay, can you ask that question on our behalf?
I'd be happy to.
Okay. Any other questions for Mr. Durbin? I would ask that we study this. If anybody doesn't have the email, I'll resend it. But I ask us that we study this and make sure that we fully understand and begin to implement some policy around this.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I do have one other question, if you have a minute.
Yes, sir.
So regarding the land and the question or the requirement on that, we have, in our last meeting, put together a team of 2 people to do a land study.
Mhm.
In your opinion, does that fall within the guidelines of the spirit of this motion right here, that we do a study and see recommend to the Board of Supervisors what the outcome of some of the IDA and the county's land holdings should be?
I'd be happy to discuss that with the board and get the board's feedback on that. I think you're hitting on, reading between the lines, I think you're hitting on that the motion talks about vacant land. And so, does that mean vacant that there's no structure on it? Does that mean that vacant that we're not using it for
Economic
a
development.
current prospect, or, right? Or vacant in that we don't see a future project in the near term?
Because we think it's practical to do our own study, issue a report. I think we have the report scheduled to come back in December, the December meeting. So as long as there's no strict timeline, we'd like to complete our report and then have that conversation at that time if there's no objection to the Board of Supervisors.
I'll certainly reach out to the board right away on that issue.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Hood. So that report, presentation was for information only. There's no board action required on that. Are there any other comments or opinions on that before we move on? Hearing none, we'll move on to items 6 and 7, the payment of invoices from Ms. West, and then she can just go right into the treasurer's report after that.
And on the claims list this month, and I'm just going to, obviously, we have electric bills every month now, so the only thing I'm going to point out there in the ADP is that we have one new one, apparently as the county is going through some of the things that they have, as they're finding things that should be coming to the EPA, they're coming. So the only new one there that you haven't seen before is the Fancy Gap Highway Communications Tower. That's a bill I haven't seen before. You have a copy of it in your packet, and it was assigned to the EDA by whomever was in the county was allocated, designating where the bills are supposed to be paid. So that is just one new one. The void check at the top is the check that we held on to for a while, but apparently, while the board was deciding on the disposition of that claim from Blue Pipes, the county paid the bill, because they had gotten behind. So we got the check back. The next item is the monthly loan payment for the industrial park building, for the note that the EDA has with the county. The next two items were the parking lot repair item and the mowing for the Little Pike Center. The mowing is being done by the county. You have a copy of that bill that's being submitted from Ricky's department. And the parking lot repair, that is the bill that came in for the labor that Ricky's crew put in there. And then the next item too, well, a little further down the Lowe's is the actual material that was used for that. The item in between there is the PSA's bill for the Cannon Rescue Building. Then there was a quarterly inspection. They are caught up on those now. I know it seems that we've had a number of those kind of closer together than quarters, but I did go back just to satisfy myself, and I looked at the dates of what they were actually billing for, and the September and the December were kind of close together, and this is now for March, so they're caught up. So we shouldn't see another one until July or June. The next item is the installment on the Cannon Rescue Building, refinance, as well as the renovations that were done there. Next item is the services bill for the accounting for May. Next item is the Town of Hillsville. This is also a new one. I haven't seen this one before. This was assigned to the EDA from the county. Apparently, it's the bill coming in from the Town of Hillsville for the water service over at the picnic shelter. Presumably, does belong to the EDA. And then the last three items are the ACHs from USDA. One is for the fire truck loan, one is for the bus loan, and one is for the bond payment on the Carroll County high school renovations. Do want to mention in conjunction with that, I did just get a letter from USDA concerning what they're going to require from us for the substantiation of our notes with them. And they do require a copy of the audit, but there is some specific documentation that they require. So I'll be putting that together for them. And we are going to be coming up on another audit, so I'm not quite sure what all that's going to entail this time. So that brings us to, you want to just go ahead to the,
Let's vote on the claims first, once you're through with that.
I do have a question. Which picnic shelter?
the one that's over there by Carter Pines.
Oh, the Wellness Center? Okay.
So we have before us Sandy's report on the claim for this month. Any questions on any of those for clarification? Hearing none, we have a motion to accept and approve.
Make a motion to approve.
We have a motion that we approve claims. Do we have a second?
Second.
We have a second. Any further discussion? If not, all in favor of approving the claims as given by Ms. West, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All opposed, say no. And they are accepted. Ms. West, you may roll right into the financial report.
The May 2020 change in fund balance, we started the period with $1,975 in the fund balance. Income for the period, and you may remember that we did have some doubling up and so forth. It's all been caught up with the exception that we have not yet received the current payment for the fire truck now it's on the county. And I think that might have been my fault because I'm supposed to send them an invoice every month, and I think because I missed one of the meetings, I missed one of the invoices, but that's been sent out, so we should be getting both of them next time. As far as the expenses are concerned, there's really nothing of note there. These are the claims that you had approved last month that they get paid in May, and there's really nothing unusual or different. As far as the debt payments, there again, the only thing that is different there, this did come up in conversation with Ricky today. There are 2 payments to Carroll County for the building note, and that is because we did not hold our actual meeting. So I have those checks with me, which I'll be giving to, well, I actually laid them on Crystal's desk for the note. before I-
So the building note, you mean the Vanguard building? Is that-
Yes, that's
Yep.
the note that we have with them for that building, yes. One of the things that the audit from the USDA did say we are going to have to substantiate this time that I haven't seen them do before, and that's going to bring us down to this last item, and that is the reserves that we are required to keep on the Carroll County High School bond. They are requiring a notification, certification of the amount of money that we have in those funds, and that we substantiate that we have them. So we do, but that's the first time that I've seen that before. Which brings us to ending funds balance of $856,483, of which $222,891 is restricted, which is that number that they're going to be looking for. $44,000 that we just approved is committed to disbursements, leaving us $588,837 in operating funds, of which $97,295 is already designated as incentive. That leaves us with operating funds available of $491,542. Questions?
Questions for Ms. West?
I move to approve the treasurer's report.
We have a motion to approve from Mr. Edwards. Do we have a second?
Second.
We have a second from Mr. Sowers. Any further discussion? Hearing none, all in favor of approving the financial report, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All opposed, say no. Thank you, Ms. West.
You're welcome. I'd like to ask the board something, if we may, with regards to the packets and the claims. Most of you are aware that we've been working through recycled paper for a long time, because during the high school project, we used a lot of paper. And my office has kept it, and we worked our way down literally from a stack about this high to probably one more meeting. And so my only question is, how do you feel about, is there an alternative to, in the case where we have, like this month, we've got 20, 25 bills, and I'm making 10 packets for the records, I think we continue to make the records, obviously. Is there any opportunity for a way to do this that would be electronic, that could be given to the board for review as opposed to the paper? Or I'll just start printing paper again and turn it over and do it again the next time. I mean, that's up to you. I just wanted to bring it before you to see if that's something you want to consider.
My personal opinion, it would be that you give your report with PowerPoint if it's capable of doing that, and then prior to the meeting, you just send out an electronic copy of that presentation to the board members, so that way they can see. Just about everybody here has an electronic device of some type where we can read it, and we don't need to print all that paper. That's my opinion. Anybody else having
I think it's
a better opinion?
Good idea.
Okay? We'll work towards it. I won't guarantee it for the next go-around, but we'll work towards it. I think I got enough paper for one more. Thank you.
Okay, so we're moving down through the agenda now. We're to old business. And last month, we asked Ms. McCraw to go out and do a study on the contract for Little Tykes Daycare Center, and turn the floor over to Ms. McCraw at this time to
All right.
present.
So I did spend quite a bit of time on preparing a new lease before consulting with Mr. Durbin. And I have the new lease, I have one copy of the new lease, only because after talking to Mr. Durbin, we have some other options before we get to that point. That's why I didn't print a copy for each of you. So I'm going to go through those with you all and interject if you feel the need to do that, if I mess something up. So during one of our first conversations with with Mr. Durbin, he pointed out that in the current lease, there is a clause that more or less states the lease automatically renews regardless of whether there's any documentation signed. So even though it would appear to us that it more or less expired in January, that really wasn't the case. However, because of a couple different things, we could present to her a new lease, but we have to provide her a written document that we're going to do that. The first one of those being that because she did not pay her new amount, which became effective January 2019, it essentially makes it null and void. So we could present to her to make up that amount because that money is still due to us, whether or not we went after it or not. She still signed the agreement, it's in the agreement, it's owed to the EDA. The other thing, we could do a new lease, which I have. We could do a notice of default on her current lease and terminate it and issue a new one. Or we could, as an EDA, and now I guess the Board of Supervisors, come to an agreement to offer her the opportunity to purchase that property and operate it on her own. Now, there are some significant changes to the new lease, and I will be more than happy to email that to you all, but like I said, I wanted to get your all's opinion before I did that. Anything else to add?
I think it's very well stated. It's, unfortunately, the way the term of lease is drafted, it does leave some confusion. You can read it several ways, but the way that, when you read it in context with the lease as entirety, including the exhibits that are attached, it really appears the intention was that there was going to be a 6-year initial term. 1 year of that was going to be probationary. At the end of the 6 years, the lease automatically renews for a term of 5 additional years in accordance with the payment schedule that's attached. So I think that the sense of the board initially was that we're operating on a month-to-month after the lease had expired, but really this lease remains in effect. As Ms. McCraw stated, the payment schedule controls, and it's my view that regardless of whether what the invoices may have said, the agreement between the EDA, IDA at that time, and the tenant is what would control. However, you have some options. You could negotiate another lease term, something with different terms than what you've already agreed to. You could enforce your rights by a notice of default. You could enforce your rights by a notice that, well, you're in arrears, but we'll give you an opportunity to catch up on that, whether that's over a term of 1 month or you've got a 5-year term. You could allow the arrears to be caught up in that way. You could provide additional incentives if there's some additional consideration or service that the tenant might be offering. You could negotiate a sale of the property if that's attractive to both sides. So you've got options, but at the end of the day, I think where you are right now is you've got a lease term of 5 years because neither party gave written notice, and you have a right to be paid in accordance with the rate schedule.
I do want to also interject that it was brought to my attention by Mr. Durbin, the lease that is currently on file was not drafted with legal guidance, per se. So it was essentially drafted by the administrator at that time with no consultation from a legal advisor. And so the lease that I drafted, which is very specific in regard to some of the things that we have discussed, did go to Mr. Durbin for more or less his approval. So it is now, I guess, on us as a board to decide what we want to do to move forward.
I appreciate you pointing that out after I just said the lease term is confusing. At least we didn't draft that part.
Questions or direction, I guess?
What's the current monthly payment? $750?
Uh-huh. It is $750 right now. It was supposed to go up to $750 in January 2019, but we didn't do that till January 2020.
And
Maybe-
just for the record, we need to get in the minutes why we didn't go up until January
Well,
of 2020.
the thought of a sale intrigues me. If you do a cap rate on $750 a month, it's no return on that kind of investment.
It would also get us out from underneath, in my opinion, this stuff, this maintenance that we're having to take care of every month.
Also, no, it's a service to the community. You gotta think about that. But if she would be amicable to purchasing it at a fair market rate, then certainly that's capital that the county could use.
Right.
Well, and
I'm sorry.
correct me if I'm wrong, I believe it's tax exempt, so it's not on the tax rolls currently.
It isn't, but the taxes on it, I know that we're not making, she's not even paying the tax.
Right, the lease doesn't provide, the lease provides that the landlord would be responsible for any taxes, and you're tax exempt, so
Right.
it's effectively off the tax
I
rolls
do
right now.
also think that if we continue with the lease, there are things that the current agreement asks for that we don't have on file. We don't have her proof of insurance. She's supposed to have 2 policies. And even her address is outdated in the current lease. So, just some things like that.
And I guess my question on that, I'm like Larry, I'm intrigued by the notion of just offering it for sale.
Right.
One question I'd have on that, would we even entertain the option of holding the promissory note on that and just financing it through the EDA, or is that something that we would consider?
Our company just did a quote on a daycare in a neighboring county, and it's comparable to that, so that's where I'm getting my numbers from. Certainly, the county could use the capital, I think, if the board of supervisors would be amicable to that. She could continue operating. I think it's a service. I mean, the mothers need daycare. I don't know how we want to approach it, but
If it's and I'd like to hear everybody else's opinion on this as well, but if it's something that we would consider financing through the county, like we've done other things, I'd be interested in getting together a sheet on that to just see what that would look like. It wouldn't bind us to anything, it'd just kind of give us a second option. One option is to continue the lease as is, just extended for 5 more years, but one option would be to have a county-financed purchase of this thing from their business. Any comments from this side of the room? Questions?
Would that be something that Salel would need to discuss with her?
I think we've got the right to put together a sheet of what that would look like. Not necessarily an offer sheet, but just what the terms would be, what the price we would have to have. We may want to do a
Parameters for your negotiation,
certain.
Okay.
something like that.
So, you've given a report, what do you want us to do this time? You want us to take an action or continue study for 1 more month?
I would like to see us put something into action. We've been talking about it since August. But that's ultimately our decision as a group as to what action we want to take.
So I guess if you're prepared to make a motion
Okay.
for something, we can start with that and see where that goes.
Okay,
You
so.
prepared to make a motion?
And how would you word that? I make a motion to entertain the sale of the Carroll County Daycare Center to Little Tykes. Would it be Little Tykes, or would you do it to Tammy Little? I think that the lease,
I might leave it open to just,
That's probably a trade
Entertain.
name, isn't it? It's not a
It is,
legal
but
entity.
it is, it does, oh no, it doesn't even mention her, it is just Little Tykes, yeah. Or Little Adventure Learning Academy.
entertain options for sale of the property.
We need something in writing, so
Oh,
one of the things.
You have,
One question. If I understand it legally, the only thing we could do is declare the lease in default and request payment of the back rent. Or let it continue as it is
You
with
could-
the automatic renewal.
You could give notice of the arrearage, that's a breach, and that you're contemplating a declaration of default. You could have discussions about entering into a new lease. You could enter into discussions about the sale of the property. Or you could,
If she were to not be cooperative, she wants to continue as is, then basically we would have to declare the lease in default.
right.
you'd have a decision to make on how you'd want to proceed with that. Right.
Would it be a good idea to have her come in at the next meeting and discuss this?
I think so. I think it would be even a better idea to have Mr. Dalton go out and approach her and gauge whether a purchase would be something that she'd want to do. That way we don't have that discussion and take up a lot of board time to have that discussion, so. So, I guess, just as an action item, I'm not sure whether a formal motion would be required, but probably should, that we ask Mr. Dalton to go out and have a discussion on how she'd like to pursue this, whether continue to lease or whether there would be an interest in purchase. That way that gives us a little bit of direction as a board prior to the next meeting. I'll offer that as a motion if that's okay. So my motion is that we direct Mr. Dalton to go out and have a conversation to gauge her interest in
That's right.
continuing with the lease or pursuing a purchase
That's right.
agreement. So we have a second?
I'll second that.
We'll vote on this motion very quick while we're waiting on Ms. McCraw. So any other discussion on just getting?
He would explain to her the ramifications of continuing with the lease, right? In regard to.
That's correct. I
Okay.
think that would be appropriate.
Okay.
All in favor of instructing Mr. Dalton to have that conversation between now and next meeting, signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All opposed, say no. Ms. McCraw, do you have a written motion for us?
Well, I have yeah. I make the motion to pursue the option to sell the Carroll County Child Care Center to the current tenant. And I don't know if we need to name that or not. No?
I
Okay.
think so, sir. So we're not gonna offer her
Oh, did I need to include that?
it needs to include what you wanted to say.
So we need to include if she doesn't want to buy it.
That's,
Okay. Or, okay, give me just. Okay, so, or just add it to the end or continue with the current lease.
that's correct.
Okay. So I make the motion to pursue the option to sell Carroll County Child Care Center to the current tenant or continue with current lease.
You have the motion before you. Do we have a second?
I second.
We have a second from Mr. Chambers. We have any discussion on the motion? We're ready to vote. All in favor of the motion signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All opposed say no. So the motion is approved. So the next item is, I'm not sure why Mr. Dalton didn't have it on the agenda, but it has to deal with the Virginia produce tax rebate. I see some representatives from Virginia Produce in our audience today. And first and foremost, we want to thank you for being a job creator and a business in Carroll County. We want to, every chance we get, take the opportunity to say thank you for creating jobs and creating a business that brings together a lot of markets, farmers, and transportation, and provides jobs here in the county. So thank you for that. So during the last month, Virginia Produce actually had an invitation for us that were able to come out to visit their facility and take a tour and find out what their facility was all about. I think many of us in this room took that tour. Quite educational. It's good to get to walk through another factory. The question I think before us then is the tax rebate agreement that goes back, I think, to 2017. We were provided some documentation, I think, as early as February. We received some extra documentation last month to add to our picture. And so right now, I'm going to open up the discussion for a little bit of discussion, but I would actually like to have a motion. I think we've talked about this a long time. If anyone's ready to go ahead and make a motion, then we'll discuss the motion. That's the way I would prefer to do that. But if we want to have any comments or discussion prior to the motion, that's fine too. But we're going to work toward getting a resolution of this issue tonight. So, any comments, questions, statements from board members concerning the rebate of this tax for 2019? Hearing none, I'm going to ask Mr. Beamer if he'd like to come and say anything to the board about the business and about the program or any of your representatives, if you'd like to just come and address the board on anything. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, board, for having us, and thank you, Chairman, for all the work y'all put into it and all the work that we've done. I think there's a few questions here that's been involved with this that's showing that I think it was just a lack of people knowing and understanding what we done, how we done it, and the way it was all done. And I hope the board now understands, that we are a processing and manufacturing company. It's pretty well proven between, we got papers here to show, just like our food safety. We're on a level of food safety that, federal government says we're a manufacturer. There's a lot of things here to look at on this, but it's pretty simple. When you take what we have been presented to us on what it takes to be a manufacturer, I think we've covered every angle of it, and I hope that the board, the ones that was able to come and look, seen that also. We employ now about 150 people. Through the crisis we've had here in the county, we've been very blessed. As a matter of fact, a lot of people's laying people off, and we've hired 20 some more. So, we're still pushing to try to keep things going in the right direction. But, I feel like I'm standing here in front of a board that's supposed to be here to help and to do what they can for the industries of the county and try to bring in new industries instead of having to battle to try to get what you're supposed to for the industries that's here. It's kind of discouraging to a company of our size and what we're doing. But I want to thank y'all for the time, and any questions we need to answer, I think we got the documentation and all together to take care of whatever you need.
Very good.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lloyd. Any questions or any comments?
I didn't go on the tour, but I've been over at Virginia Produce several times before. And I know that you are a manufacturer, but in the documentation that Ms. Zimmerman gave us, it says three things. It begins with raw material, it's manipulated, and then a new product has been formed. So what do you manufacture that is changed at the end?
I'm gonna put my 2 cents worth in there. In this particular process, they're bringing in raw corn, and they're converting that into something that's collated, wrapped, sealed, and available for retail distribution.
But it's still corn.
So I come out of a process where we did packaging on the back end, but, tobacco industry where everything from a certain point is all packaging. It's boxes, cartons, cases, pallets, and all of that equipment is considered to be a manufacturing process. I do not understand, and at the point at which it enters that process, it's not considered, to be changed states from one state to another like she's claiming right there. This is actually now coming from something that's unusable, packaged, collated, and sent to consumers at retail that is a usable thing, just like many other companies do out there. I'll respectfully disagree with Ms. Zimmerman, and I asked today for a little more clarification, and
But it's
I
not just
didn't
Ms.
get satisfied on
It's
it.
not just Ms. Zimmerman, it's the Supreme Court.
The Supreme Court didn't say anything about Virginia produce. The Supreme Court in those 3 bullet points right there tell me very, very.
I'd like to ask to look at some facts. How many rebates has been paid on that contract? Was there 2 years of rebates that were
We've already had 2 years
rebated?
rebate, and you know, another point to put to this, Del Monte and all the processors that's out here, they take the raw product of corn, and when you open that can, it's still corn. But it's a process, and it's a manufacturing.
Okay.
So we're doing the same thing that they.
Who made the decision that it was okay to give the first rebate? Obviously, somebody decided that you were a manufacturer and they rebated 1 or 2 years. So why, that was either wrong then or we're wrong now. We can't, common sense tells you we don't change horses in the middle of the stream. Did your contract state that they would rebate? This was before I came on the board. It states that they're going to rebate the machinery and tools.
I can take it if you want me to.
So
That's fine.
if I could just make a few points. I certainly respect Virginia Produce and respect the points that you're making. I think what's generated this is, obviously there's been a turnover with the board wanting to look more closely at the way everything's done in the county, Board of Supervisors meeting. And so the question arose, what are the terms of the agreement? How is that approved? How is it defined in the agreement? Because frankly, if 2 parties agree that machinery and tools are copiers and scanners and pens and pencils, you can agree that in a contract. So I think the first thing is, how does the contract define it?
Yeah,
And if
that's
the
basically what I'm asking is.
Yeah, and if the contract doesn't define it, then we go to, well, how's it normally understood in Virginia law? In Virginia law, machinery and tools has a very definite definition. So the question that I raised, I think with Mr. Dalton last month, was, what are the terms of the actual contract? And I've seen a proposal that would include certain economic incentives for this transaction. I haven't seen the agreement or the minutes where that was all approved and memorialized. And I feel like I need to see that in order to be able to give advice to the board, to this board, as to whether to approve that payment or not. And I hate to be the one to stand up and argue for more delay, but I've got to tell you honestly, I'm not sure what the terms are. Now, I didn't realize that Ms. Cannon was with Virginia Produce, and we've had a brief conversation before the meeting began, and maybe in short order, I can see what I need to see to give you an opinion. But right now, I can't tell you what machinery and tools means in context of this agreement.
So, and my first question would be, when did Mr. Dalton and you have this conversation? A month ago?
Yeah, I believe so.
So.
And my response back was well, I feel like I need to see some additional documentation.
And did you ask him for that documentation?
Yes.
And I'm assuming that none was given to you.
I haven't seen, I've seen the performance agreement, and I've seen the economic development proposal. I'm having trouble seeing where that was incorporated, they were incorporated together in some way.
So.
Because the proposal is just an offer until it's actually voted on and approved by
So to
this
follow
body.
along with Mr. Edwards' line of reasoning, how did we get to the point of paying it for 2017 calendar tax year and 2018 tax year? And now we're questioning it in the terms that we're questioning the transaction. What's, other than the opinion from Mr. Dalton, is there anything that's substantively changed since it has been paid for those two tax years, 2017 and 2018? And I'm trying to say this with all due respect to everybody. It's just that we've got a business in the county that is, seem like it's delayed, and we're not being attentive to their concern. And I want us to bring that to the front of the list and be attentive to their concern. 2 years ago, 3 years ago, they had no problem with this, and now there seems to be a big problem.
Well, I can't tell you. I can't tell you the process in prior years. That question was never posed to me, and I haven't seen the original documents. I mean, it may be that this would be easy to resolve. It may be that there are going to be more questions that this board needs to address. But the fact that it was done in the past doesn't necessarily answer the question of whether there's authorization to do it and whether it's right to do it today as we stand here.
Have any of you guys seen the signed document?
Mr. Beamer, do you have the original documents, a copy of them?
Right. Do you mind if we walk out for just a minute? I didn't think I would be up here again, but good evening, everyone. Okay, economic development deals. And Sandy, do you know who cut the first check on that one?
I did.
By whose direction? Gary's. Okay, so you had, back in 2017, there were basically 4 agencies, including the IDA at the time. I realize that's now the EDA. You had different contracts for different performance standards in the agreement. Okay, you have the Tobacco Commission, where there's a jobs requirement of 70 jobs. Okay, you have an AFID agreement that has a job requirement of 30 jobs. There are signed documents for AFID and for the Tobacco Commission that refer to the incentives that Carroll will be providing. I know there's a box on the AFID agreement. Did you get a copy of the AFID? Okay.
What I'm pulling is tobacco.
Okay, I'll get you a copy of the AFID agreement. In the minutes of the May 2nd, 2017 IDA at the time, you had a Baby Fresh incentive, which is the only place that is referred to Baby Fresh is on the performance proposal, or the proposal, the economic development proposal. So you basically have a name for a project that is tied to the proposal. In these minutes, it says, Mr. Chambers made the motion to approve the appropriation of $150,000 in incentive funds for the Baby Fresh project. Mr. Sowers seconded the motion, and it was approved with a 6-0 vote. Okay? So if you refer back to the performance proposal, and I don't know if everyone here has a copy of it, but I would,
The Project Fresh proposal?
yes.
Yes, that's what I have.
Okay. So in this proposal is where the tax rebate is referred to. Okay? And from that standpoint, what I would contend, and honestly, we sent original word in January. We sent word again in February. We've not gotten a lot of feedback about why there has been a delay in refunding the incentive, because normally it's pay back to Virginia Produce the day we pay the taxes for the past 2 years. And I say we, I was actually over here at the time, but the day they paid the taxes, the IDA typically came and handed us a check on that. Okay? I do realize that it refers to M&T taxation in this proposal, but there's also a real estate tax portion in this proposal. So if there was a holdup on the classification of the rebate on the machinery and tools, at a minimum, we should have received the real estate tax portion. I don't have the AFID agreement in hand. I wish I do. I know the executive director of the IDA does, or the EDA, because we actually had to send the completed, basically where we are, the status of the project. And most everything that we have done to date is add employees. We've added taxable assets. The Tobacco Commission agreement doesn't refer to machinery and tools. It refers to taxable assets. You know, because normally, regardless of whether it's machinery and tools or personal property, there was an investment by VPC in Carroll County to not only employ people, but to increase the tax base. And not only did we pay that, but really in hindsight, it looks like we paid more than we should have because we were taxed at a higher business personal property rate than the machinery and tools rate. So from that standpoint, I understand there's a question on a signature on a proposal, but there are references to items in these proposals that are on signed documents by the IDA and by the powers on those documents, AFID and VDAX and the Tobacco Commission.
So how much total capital have you spent through this approximately?
A lot. Yeah, it's about 700,000.
So-
And honestly, we're still adding machinery as we speak. There was capital in process where we had bought more machines to automate the process.
So as I read the performance agreement, in order to have the minimum requirement, it was $600,000 to meet the minimum capital, right?
Yes, we were at about 100, if I remember, and please don't hold me to this exact figure, but I think we were at like 121% of that standard. So, I mean, honestly, we just want transparency. We want everyone to be sitting at a table talking about it because really, to this day, until I walked in here, we didn't know what the holdup was. We just knew we weren't getting any feedback. You know, I appreciate.
So really, the error is because machine and tool was not defined in the agreement, right?
Well, you say error, I'm not exactly sure.
Because it does not define what machine and tool is in the proposal or in the agreement, and we issued the money for machine and tool tax. The error is because that was not defined.
The issue is that they actually rebated on the business personal property tax in prior years. So I don't know what error we had, well, I say we, let me rephrase.
When you filed, or when you listed for these taxes, and I've got the documents here, you listed as machine and tool, correct?
Yes. And then when the tax ticket came in, it was classified as business personal property.
It was changed.
Because according to the commissioner, according to the Supreme Court of Virginia,
The
it's not a
Supreme Court
machine
of
and tool.
Virginia has not weighed in on VPC. I understand the Supreme Court of Virginia has set parameters by which what kind of property qualifies for
right.
machinery and tools. In all honesty, if you look at the product and you take 120 people and sort corn, take the husk off the corn, put it in a package, buy machines to wrap it and to label it, I don't understand how you're not taking a raw product and transforming it to something that can go on Food Lion shelves on your way home. Feel free to pick some up. I don't understand how that's the same. So, but that's a Commissioner of Revenue question to answer. It's not really an EDA question to answer. Because really, the only person who has the authority to change that is the Commissioner of Revenue, and we will follow that process as need be. But I can get the copies to the documents to Mr. Durbin. I'd be happy to.
So, just to clarify, and this is my understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, but all of the capital was listed as machine and tool.
Yes,
but
sir.
the Commissioner of Revenue reclassified it to
Business personal property.
business personal property, which, by the way, is taxed at a higher rate than machine and tool. So they not only spent the capital, but they actually were taxed at a higher rate than machine and tools. So they've actually.
And the EDA rebated more money
Yeah,
on the incentive
in the
in
first 2 years.
17 and 18. So,
And you make plans, and I'm sure Mr. Beamer's had plans, worked with him. And then in the middle of it, you change. This has happened to me half a dozen times in Carroll County. It's almost a pattern. That's the reason I don't work in Carroll County, even though I live here, and I hate to make that statement. But you gotta do what you gotta do. I have a real problem in the middle of all of this. We're changing horses.
well, I think we might have went to a mule.
So I'm going to ask Mr. Durbin if we could have a somewhat of a compromise here. We legally couldn't disperse a check until we have a claims approval next month at our next meeting, correct? Could we approve this tonight? And then essentially, assuming no contrary facts come in over the course of the next month, essentially approve it, give the second approval and final approval in our claims for July?
I think you could make a motion to approve subject to confirmation of all the documentation at next month's meeting, or by next month's meeting.
Okay.
Do something like that.
So, I have a letter that I sent to you guys last month from Jennifer Hawks that said that the refund, in her calculation, is $20,691.81. Does that sound
I haven't
reasonable?
seen the documents yet. They haven't been sent to me like they normally would be for approval to process. The only thing I would say that I recollect from the prior documents is that there were vehicles listed that were removed.
Those were removed on my calculation as well, and I have the documents here if you'd like to go.
That's the only thing that I remember that we ended up changing. And that approval on 17 and 18 were documents that were provided to me to reimburse with a authorization from the current executive director of the IDA at the time.
So I guess it's up to this board right now. We're kind of at the time where we need to either ask some more questions, or I would say that we're probably pretty close to entertaining a motion to deal with this matter. What's your pleasure?
Do we have the authority to issue the money without the Board of Supervisors approval?
Mr. Durbin, would you like to comment on that? Did you hear the question?
Yes, if you have the money in your budget and you have, you've determined, this board determines that it's a legitimate expenditure, you have the legal authority to spend the money that you have in your account, in your budget.
Now, I'll get some clarification on that. In the first two and any other that we did, this is not the only company we've done this to, correct? Sandy, we've actually offered this
This is the
incentive.
only tax rebate.
Okay. So in years past, we actually, the mechanism for refunding was through us, but then the Board of Supervisors made a transfer for those funds back to us, or how did that actually work in years past?
That's correct. The funding came ultimately from the board, but that was in the form of, we'll just say, that's fungible money. It didn't come as a specific request granted by and then dispersed. It just came in the form of money that was provided by the county for the EDA's operating expenses, including its obligations for incentives.
Can I
So
make a
it wasn't
distinction?
earmarked, it was just,
No,
it was just general funding for the E EDA.
Can I make a distinction really briefly? On your first agreement, the first process, was there real estate machinery tools rebate on that?
Ms. Cannon, if you could you come to the microphone? I can't hear you very well.
Is this the second phase? I think, just if memory serves me correctly, and you can verify this if I'm wrong, but there was also machinery and tool and real estate tax rebate on the first phase of this project that started in 2013. So it may be the first agreement you've seen real estate taxes, but this is a second portion to that.
There is more than one. The only way I could answer that and be absolutely certain would be to go back to the records and see at what dates the checks were cut.
Yeah, I really think this was,
But there has been more, there was a place where one agreement rolled into another agreement. And
Yes.
that's the more recent.
and so you have, while this started in 2017, I believe the trend of refunding real estate and machinery and tools started in 2013.
So in the documentation I have, an email January 28th of this year from Jennifer Hawks to Crystal Adams. She puts the value at $14,714.54 for real estate, and equipment was $26,669.08 for equipment. And her total is $20,691.81. Is that what
That's
you're
correct.
claiming is the amount to be refunded?
I believe I have the tax tickets with me too, if you need documentation of that. It backed up the vehicles. The vehicles weren't included in that amount.
Questions?
Was there a cap of 85,000 on
Yes,
that?
that was for all 5 years. It was 85,000 for all 5 years. So questions, comments, or a motion, I guess, at this point?
Well, Mr. Chairman, I was on the early IDA board at the time when the project out. We first went to where there wasn't even nothing in the building, the empty building. Then we got into it with Maury. And Maury not only did what he promised, he done more than he promised. So I'd like to make a motion, if he's entitled to the money, we pay it.
So do you want to insert the value, $20,691.81 into that amount? Okay. We have a motion from Mr. Chambers to refund that amount. And I'm assuming your motion is contingent on approval, the approvals for the July payables. So we have a motion, do we have a second?
I'll second it.
We have a second from Mr. Collins. Do we have any discussion on the motion? Hearing none, all in favor of approving the payment, signify by
Were we asking Mr. Durbin to look into anything, or are we good with that? Your motion, good without it?
I think you were going to bring us any relevant information to the documentation and make sure all that was in order.
And he could let us know before it's,
If I see a problem, you're gonna know before.
that's right, before it's approved.
Yes.
Right. Okay.
That's what I said, if he's entitled to it,
Yep. Okay.
everything comes quick.
So we have a motion from Mr. Chambers. We have a second from Mr. Collins. Any further discussion, any question? Thank you for that question, Richard, by the way. Any further discussion? Hearing none, all in favor of approving the payment signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All opposed say no.
No.
Let the record show that we have one no vote. Ms. McCraw? Thank you for your action on that. Thank you for your time, guys.
If I might just for a moment, I just had a vague recollection that I had been requested to look up some information for the previous administrator, most recent previous. And I do have, this is not saying that just go back further, but I do have a copy of a check that I wrote in 2016 that was for 2015 and 2016 reimbursements. So it does go back to this as well.
Okay. Okay, do we have any other old business to bring before the board?
I don't know if this is old business because we did briefly discuss it at our last meeting when we were talking about Mr. Branscombe and the pasture up there. So in my lease searching, this, I also have the pasture lease with Mr. Beamer and Virginia Produce for the tax parcels 82A 42B and 82A 42A.
Is that this lease here?
Yeah,
Okay.
that one. So I know that our last meeting, Sandy was on the phone, and we had not received the rent payment for that. Is that still true?
So, Mr. Beamer can clarify any of this, but I think I could go back and find the place in here where it's actually in cash or in improvements. Is that correct? Did,
Yes, it is.
somebody could lead me to that?
Where it will come off of the rent?
Yes.
Oh, it's on the first page.
Okay, so actually I've talked with
1.3.
Mr. Beamer, and he's more than made up the amount of the lease payment and improvements to that piece of property. And actually, I went over there and looked at it myself, so.
Okay,
If
so-
Mr. Beamer's okay with it, can you just provide us a listing of the improvements and the values of those improvements?
Be more than glad to, yeah.
And then also, this says that it's supposed to be used for grazing cattle. That's all, other than a livestock, educational facility or something like that. But is there something planted there now?
The graze cattle. Yeah, the graze cattle.
Okay, and then what about also the tax parcel behind the, Appalachian Gas building? Because there's not a lease for that, but there also appears to be something planted there as well.
That's, you guys don't,
Yes, we asked permission to try to clean that up where that it was growing up. And we actually took the time to go in there and bush hog, clean it and everything, and planted it back in grass, something that can be mowed for the cattle.
but other than that, you don't have a cattle operation or anything on that piece of
No,
property?
But-
You just cleaned
More or
it
less
up?
to try to keep it cleaned up and from it growing up the way it's been growing up.
But there was no agreement to do that, or discussion with anybody to do that, is what I'm getting at.
So I guess I would ask the question, would we rather it grow up?
I would rather there be an agreement that says he can do it.
Do we need,
I mean,
do you want to propose an agreement? Is that what you're asking?
I'm asking what is gonna be the most effective for the EDA, to get our stuff in line. And I feel like if someone's using a piece of property that is ours, we should have issued permission for that person to do that.
I would suggest that maybe we do that, and clarify that. If somebody's willing to clean up and bush hog a piece of property and sow it back in grass, I think that's, they
So-
deserve our thanks on that.
So does that mean that we need to have another lease drafted?
If Mr. Beamer doesn't have a problem with that, I would
don't
say
care.
that's
I don't
fine.
care.
So can you do that, Mr. Urban?
I'm happy to do that. If it's just, it's not, Mr. Beamer, you're not running cattle on it,
No.
you're just keeping it from growing up.
It was growing up and the hillside was about to be taken over by briars and bushes and everything else.
So,
We
so
went in
what
there
I
and
would,
bush hogged it and cleaned it up.
what I'd recommend on that is that we have if you're gonna draft the lease agreement, that you and Mr. Beamer and maybe one or two of us get together to make sure that we get an agreement that speaks to that. Because in my opinion, you know, we might find out that Moyer might wanna charge us something for that. If we get an agreement, I would expect
You're
it.
talking about bush hogging by the hour, it's about $45 an hour, so if you put that into it,
We can just add that to the tax rebate total.
My thought is, depending on what the detail, I'm happy to make those discussions, and depending on the details, I may suggest that you want to just have a license agreement or a written permission to be on the property and a liability release or something like that, but.
So if you can help us with that and get maybe me, you, Moyer, and Mandy, just have various times reach out to us and make sure that we get all the concerns in the lease agreement. I think that would be a good direction for that. I don't think we need a motion for that unless someone thinks that we do need a motion.
One thing on that, Larry and I went over to the tour, Norwich, but he was, his place the other day, and Morris took us out on the property, and I think there's quite a bit of difference from what he's done than when he started. I mean, this man, he's got decent grass, he's got, you know, the cattle could eat if he wanted to.
Yeah. Any other old business? Over to new business, and Mr. Dalton put out this agenda, and he had item A is EDA budget. Mr. Durbin, do you have any information on what that line item was?
I have no input on that.
Does any board member have any idea what Mr. Dalton was referring to on new business with EDA budget? Are there any other new business to bring before the board? There's no other new business. We have the item of approving the minutes that we postponed earlier. Do we have any further discussion? I think the amendment was made, and then I think Mr. Collins had a second amendment to make to it, if he would like to give that.
Yeah. My motion read, in the May meeting, a discrepancy was brought to the EDA board between the sale price of a parcel of land sold previously by the then IDA board and what is recorded in the county GIS. The treasurer of the EDA did not show any difference in the sale price agreed upon by the EDA and the price paid and received from the purchaser. It was requested of the treasurer of the EDA and the executive director of the EDA to further investigate and notify the board of their findings.
Sandy, is that an agreeable amendment to you? I think that's addressing part of your concern.
That sounds good to me.
Okay.
I bring that in the form of a motion.
Okay, we have a motion to add an amendment, so right now we are addressing the amendment and the amendment only, so do we have a second on the amendment?
Second.
Have a second on the amendment. Any further discussion on the amendment? And we'll vote on the amendment. All in favor of the amendment as given by Mr. Collins and seconded by Mr. Edwards, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All opposed, say no. The amendment is agreed to, so now we're talking about approving the minutes. We finally got down to that. So the approval of the minutes is before you. Do we have a motion to approve the minutes as amended?
Make a motion, we approve the minutes as amended.
So we have a motion to approve the minutes as amended by Mr. Collins. Do we have a second?
I'll second.
We have a second by Mr. Sowers. Any discussion, further discussion on the minutes? All in favor of approving the amendments as amended, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All opposed, say no. Minutes are approved. So now we're at authority members' time, so now's your time to speak up and tell us what's on your mind. Mr. Edwards, you have anything?
I think I've said enough tonight.
Mr. Collins?
I would just like to say that I would like for us to give direction to our executive director to put into place the checks and balances every year to review these contracts, review them, bring them to us, we'll review them together, whatever that entails, to make sure that the I's are dotted and the T's are crossed. Because, you know, we have an executive director that looks after those things for this board after they're approved and off of our table. we need to be reminded of those things. So I would just, I'd like to see us give him some direction.
I would add
do
to that we keep a running list of those contracts and agreements.
Yes.
Mr.
I
Sowers?
agree with you, but I think that we're gonna have to position ourselves towards a paid person in order to do
I
that.
agree. I agree.
I don't think it,
However, our current executive director is paid.
but his pie is split up.
Right. I would agree, and can I go back and say something else? I would agree, Mr. Durbin, one of your statements as to what Mr. Hill sent down to us in these 20 items was that we could have a closer working relationship. We share the same executive director with the Board of Supervisors that is also the executive director of the EDA. I don't know how we could have much closer relationship. That's just my thoughts. And the only other thing that concerns me a little bit is the comment that the Board of Supervisors could do things differently by when they make new appointments to the board or by withholding funding. And it concerns me that there might be some indication of withholding funding which would hurt the county when it comes to economic development.
I'd like to clarify
And I would appreciate that.
that that was stated in the context of your two separate legal entities.
Correct.
And there's not a proposal, there's not been a proposal, I'm not aware of anything. I was not sent to deliver any message other than what was in that resolution. But as a practical matter, if we were doing a class on Virginia law, I would tell you that the two entities are separately legal, and the only influence the Board of Supervisors in any county has over an EDA is funding and appointments. So there's nothing intended by that. I want to
I
make that
appreciate
clear.
your clarification.
Yeah.
Thank you. Mr. Chambers? If there's nothing else, then I'll declare this June meeting of the Economic Development Authority of Carroll County adjourned. And thank you for your attendance and participation.